You're listening to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast, episode 26, hosted by me, Robert Plotkin. Today I'm going to be speaking with Éowyn Ahlstrom, a longtime mindfulness, yoga, and massage therapy practitioner and teacher. She's the founder of Middle Path Healing Arts and a teacher of the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, better known as MBSR, at the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. In today's interview, Éowyn will bring her many years of experience to bear on our discussion of the promises and the challenges of bringing traditional mindfulness education into the digital world, including her experience teaching MBSR online to students around the world. We're extremely pleased to welcome Éowyn Ahlstrom to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast. After I finished the interview with Éowyn Ahlstrom that you're about to hear, Éowyn and I kept talking for a while offline, and one of the things we spoke about was the interesting fact that the format of a podcast encourages people to talk continuously, and that this is interesting to us because mindfulness practice places such a high value on silence and involves practicing being silent and experiencing silence and paying attention to our feelings and thoughts while we're silent. It made me think about where this came from. I know people who were in radio years ago, and they talked to me about having to really learn how to keep talking continuously because it's not really, a natural thing, at least for a lot of people. And it developed from the need to avoid, quote, dead time on the air because of the fear that a listener would immediately change the station if there was silence on the radio. And it made me realize that I had, in doing the podcast, been training myself unintentionally to learn how to continue to speak continuously for that same reason, to not lose listeners. So, I thought it would be interesting to try doing something quite different, an experiment in which we provide 20 seconds of silence. And it's a bit scary for me because I don't know whether any of you are going to tune out or listen to something else and not come back. I don't know what it's going to feel like. I don't know how people will respond to it. So I'd like to ask you, see if you can stick with us during the silence and use it as an experiment for yourself to see what it feels like to, quote, listen to silence in a podcast. So I'm going to set a timer here, and we're going to try out 20 seconds of podcast silence starting now. All right, that was 20 seconds of silence. I wonder what it felt like for you. For me, definitely scary. I have no idea how this is going to be received. It's unusual. I don't think I've heard it done before, but if you want to share your own experience with, listening to 20 seconds of silence on a podcast, how that felt, use it to meditate or maybe to do something else. Share whatever your experience may have been with us. And now I hope you enjoy the upcoming non-silent interview with Éowyn Ahlstrom. Hi, Éowyn. Welcome to the Technology for Mindfulness podcast.
Hi, Robert. Nice. I won't say nice to hear you. Nice to see you.
Yeah, we, as you know, one of the strange things about the podcast is that although you and I are in the same town right now, I had told you it's best for audio purposes for us to each be at our own computer remotely from each other. So it's kind of telling.
Right. It's technology in action.
It is. It is. And that's, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, and this is something you and I have talked about a number of times live in person, was the relationship of technology to the way in which mindfulness is taught. Mindfulness is something that traditionally was taught very much in person and transmitted down from person to person in person. And you as a mindfulness teacher have experienced that and are very much involved in a lot of the work and experimentation that's going on now to try to make use of computer technology and online media for teaching mindfulness. So I'm sure we could spend a whole hour talking about that because it's a big topic, but maybe you could start by talking a little bit about your background as a teacher in the pre-technology days, and then how that transition and experiment with going online is working, and what some of the promises and challenges of it are.
This is a huge topic. We're living in very interesting times. I understand that's actually in Chinese, a curse. May you live in interesting times. I think we do. So it's true that I started teaching before I started teaching online. And that I am, first a yoga teacher and then trained as a mindfulness teacher. I teach at the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts. So I teach MBSR and other mindfulness programs there. And I continue to teach yoga, which is also, by the way, being more and more offered online. I just got an invitation to a live online yoga class, the first one I've seen. Previously, they've been recorded, right? So part of this topic maybe is about the very recent shift from recorded online offerings, which is one thing, to live encounters online and endeavoring to teach that way. But part of it also is maybe about embodiment and how and whether being in the same room together matters or doesn't matter to teaching this kind of practice. Yeah. So there are lots of big questions here. It's just been in the last 3 years that we at the Center for Mindfulness have started offering live online MBSR classes. And that's been, it's been fascinating to me to do that. On the one hand, just this last cycle, which ended for me last Tuesday, I had 8 weeks online with a community of people, included folks from South Africa, Cairo, Spain, Uruguay, the United States, Canada, and that's just a handful. Switzerland, I could go on. There were 30 plus people in the class, and we were together in the sense that we were live and talking to one another. It's not a webinar format. So this, my goodness, very beautiful in some ways, very, very beautiful. The opportunity to connect with people from around the world and share interest in practicing mindfulness and actually do practices together. I guide meditations, I guide yoga practices in the online conference room. So that it's amazing. And on the other hand, I can tell you that the challenges are, I do really feel like being in a room with somebody is different, physically in a room with somebody is different than being online. Even right now, you and I have sat together in my office fairly frequently, right. You sit in one comfortable chair, I sit in another, and we talk. Yeah. And so maybe I'll put it this way and tie it into something really ancient. The Buddha described human experience as having 6 sense bases, and they're basically the 5 normal ones that you're used to hearing about: seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and then the body, which is more than just touching with your fingers. It's everything to do with the senses of the body, the whole entire ability to feel, including, for example, being able to feel when your hand is behind you, even though you can't see it and it's not touching anything else, right? So interoception and proprioception and all of that would be included in the body as one of the senses. And then the sixth sense, the mind, so the ability to think and feel and know cognitively. So when we're in a room together, Robert, we share the same soundscape. We share the same visual scape. Yeah. When we're online, right now we don't have visual at all. So my visual field and yours are completely separated. We have the ability to control to some degree how much our soundscapes interact based on muting and unmuting and what microphones we use and, which we were playing around with at the beginning, what's the best quality sound we can get, so there's a mediation of the senses in the online environment that it's very different from what happens when we come together physically in a room.
It's very interesting. I think that when people talk about online education of any kind, we often talk about whether there's a video component of it. Is the student seeing something, or is it just audio? But you mentioned something different, which is, are we both seeing and hearing the same thing as each other at the same time?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, maybe when we're sitting in the same room together, we're not either, because each of us is perceiving through our own mental lenses. I might be much more interested, for example, in color than you are, or vice versa. And so I might see more color than you do, or vice versa, So in some way, we're probably never sharing completely. But we have access to the same space in some way when we're together physically. I don't know. This is kind of mind blowing to me. Just starting to recognize this, and it's interesting. One of the things I do in class, and you can try it right now if you want. Are you sitting at a computer screen, Robert?
I am.
Yeah. So just for a minute, widen your visual field so that the computer becomes part of what you're looking at, instead of the main thing. Maybe you weren't even mainly looking at it to start with, but, just often when we're in the video conference environment, people, they come right into the screen, and they're looking at all the squares of other people, and they forget about the field of sight around the computer screen. Yeah. So, it can be fun to play with the place that the device is taking in the visual field, in your mind in some way as well. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Just to be totally honest and transparent, I was both looking only at the screen. Once you asked me to step back, I noticed I was physically hunched over. And I was mostly focused on the audio levels that I can see scrolling by me in the software I'm using to record the podcast.
You're right. Yeah.
So there was a part of my mind that was also focused on how well is the recording going of what we're saying, in addition to being focused on the actual conversation. That's, of course, completely different than it would be if we were sitting in your office.
Yes, very different. Yeah. So that's, are you still there? My screen just went dark.
No, I'm still here, and we can either edit that out or not, because this all relates to
it really
what
does.
Technology introduces into the live interaction.
Yeah, it really does, Robert. So I must have a setting on my computer, that has it go to sleep or something. It has the screen go to sleep after a certain number of minutes that I haven't touched the keyboard, right? And that just happened. So we're in it already. The game changing nature of introducing technology into our lives. Now that's been a long, slow process that you probably know more about than I do, the development of technologies historically speaking. which seems to be gaining speed. Yeah. But then also what I think you're really interested in the podcast, which is how that relates to something that is a vast world of its own, historical and contemporary, flowing one from the other. Mindfulness practices, as they've been engaged in by human beings for a long time. And this is the introduction of technology to that is just, it's a game changer, as people like to say. It shifts everything in some way. And maybe what's interesting is if we're not paying attention, it can shift things in ways that we don't notice. Now, you were saying to me when we were prepping for this that it turns out we're not really very good at predicting long-term effects of our exciting new ideas. Did I understand you rightly?
Yeah, we're usually not very good. I think from my study of the history of technology and from being a user and developer of it for a long time, our tendency is to focus on whatever the latest, coolest features of the technology are. The fact that it can show live video of someone else in real time. We tend to focus in very narrowly on those features and what their direct effects would be. And then we often individually and culturally do what I'd call a naive or simple-minded extrapolation from that, as if there'll be no other side effects of it. And we tend to then be either surprised by the side effects when they occur, or as you said, not really pay attention to them. They occur, but they go into the background. For an example would be constant connectivity was something that I think a lot of people didn't predict the ability to. But by constant connectivity, I mean the ability to be connected to the internet all the time, anywhere you are, at very low cost, that this could lead to people actually feeling less connected relationally or socially to each other. All the predictions, or almost all of them early on, was this was going to help people connect in the way we normally use that term, form stronger personal bonds with each other. And we now know that can be true, but isn't necessarily true. It's not an automatic consequence of better, more frequent, easier technological connectivity. So there's many effects like that. And I'm sure that at the Center for Mindfulness, everyone there must be applying mindfulness even to the planning of how to change the delivery of, I don't even want to call it delivery necessarily, but you know what I mean, how the courses are structured and formatted and the kinds of media they're delivered through. I wonder if you could even talk a little bit about, the process that's gone into thinking through that and what noticing there's been as you've tried different iterations of the delivery of, let's just say, MBSR.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. But first, I want to go back a little ways because it seems to me you named one really interesting, unsuspected, call it a drawback of connectivity, that it doesn't necessarily connect us. I want to say also that from my experience, it seems like there may be health risks associated with a lot of technology use that are still maybe quite unidentified, which is really interesting because it seems like that might relate to what you were saying about we see the features, we're just seeing the features. We're seeing the magic, so to speak. There's a great quote. I like to watch TV, Robert. And I try to be disciplined about it. I don't, I choose things. I avoid commercials. I treat it actually the way I treat most technology, with caution, with a recognition that, there are health risks involved. Anyway, I recently spent some time quite enjoying a show that's probably the target audience is probably like, adolescent girls. Yeah. So it was a show called Once Upon a Time. It's a fantasy thing. Yeah. And in the show, there's a magician, and he's kind of a evil, good magician, and has one of those laughs that you might expect from an evil, good magician. And he says repeatedly throughout 6 seasons of the show to anyone who will listen, he says, magic always comes with a price, dearie. And it's, I think it's quite wonderful, actually, for me to think about the audience of this program getting that message again and again, because technology really, we talk about science, yeah? But there is a magical quality to all of this, there's a magical quality. We know how it's happening, and that's actually how magic becomes accessible, is when we can understand how to change, how to apply a law we didn't understand before, So, anyway, I'm taking this in a direction you weren't steering me.
That's okay. That's fine.
It's really interesting to me. I think magic comes with a price. Technology comes with a price. Yeah. And it's really helpful to be aware of it, what the prices are.
Right. I mean, if you think of it from the perspective of mindfulness, just to see it for what it really is, if we're focused on the features, I mean, those are real and true. Not to ignore them or discount them, and just to throw technology out in the garbage, but to see the complete set of features that it really has. Positive, negative, neutral, as we say. And, culturally, I often see, one of the worlds I live in the world of high-tech startups and entrepreneurs, for many years, I would say, overall, the view was very lopsided towards what I call cheerleading, really seeing almost only the positive features of technology. What we're talking about is if you step back and are able to we can't eliminate all of our lenses, but try to see the lenses or filters we have for what they are. Maybe we'll be able to see some of the positives and negatives in a more realistic light.
Well, that's really interesting. The mention in some way of our blind spots and how, subjective bias is a well-known phenomenon. We all have it. Yeah. Yeah. And so the question, how do we start to see our own filters and then actually work with what's happening to incline our situation personally, socially, culturally, globally, in a direction that is more likely to produce well-being, and less likely to produce suffering. So the application of mindfulness in the situation of technology has potential there, I think. I know from my own experience.
Yeah, and something just occurred to me, which is now going in a very different direction, but I just wonder what your thoughts on it are, which is, we talk about seeing the positives and negatives of technology. I think about in my own direct experience of technology, it can create a lot of immediate pleasure. But you just used the term well-being, and, lots of experiences of immediate pleasure, going on Facebook or reading a news article or email or whatever your own thing is that brings you those hits of immediate pleasure may not contribute to your long-term well-being.
That's correct. And may, in fact, contribute to your long-term dis-ease. So that's sobering.
Yes. So I don't know if you could talk either from your own experience as a practitioner or as a teacher. Is there, have you found any ways to address that or help people see, notice that more in themselves and integrate it into their lives, specifically in connection with use of technology, which can so powerfully produce pleasure in the short term?
Yeah. I think there's a few things. I could talk for a long time. I just wrote a short blog post for CFM Home, which is the Center for Mindfulness's online community, right, called Embodied Computing. And for me as a practitioner, and people are, of great variety in what works for them, and that maybe is also part of what's challenging for us as human beings. We don't all necessarily need or respond to the same things. But for me as a mindfulness practitioner and a yoga practitioner, embodiment is tremendously helpful in all ways. And it's interesting because as much as technology tends to support disembodiment, practicing being in the body and with the body, I mean, my own and what's here, but also like the chair is a body, the computer itself, the metal and plastic of it is a body. The physicality, the materiality of the world, which often we disconnect from when we engage with technology, can be a resource for navigating some of the potential pitfalls, right? So if I sit down to work on a piece of writing, which is something I do fairly often, and I do it on the computer, if I set the intention to pay attention to my body while I work, then, I might lose track of my body dozens of times in the process of working. But every time I remember that I have that intention, I reconnect. And there's an opportunity there, an opportunity to, roll my shoulders, right? Stand up, walk around. Part of what I was writing about in the post is that I noticed that when I commit to that as a practice, a couple of things. One, I'm less likely to get over-focused on the project. But two, I find the work actually tends to go easier and feel less stressful overall if I practice in that way. And this maybe relates to actually where you were wanting to go a while ago, Robert, which is, what am I seeing about teaching in the online environment? It's similar. I find that if I make the technology a conscious part of what's happening in the teaching and learning process, that's helpful. Yeah. If I let the technology fall into the unconscious background, the way you were so clearly describing, that it, you're doing something and you don't even know you're doing it, and you're doing it through technology. Then subjective bias and habits tend to rule the day and get stronger. Yeah. But if I include it, if I can tolerate the fact that right now, as I'm talking to you, the earbuds feel a little weird, then that helps me to actually have the opportunity to choose things that are going to support well-being rather than just choosing short-term pleasures that will lead to long-term suffering. Yeah.
And are you saying that does this change in any way how you're teaching, when you're teaching, let's say, MBSR online, part of what you'll do is have students step back and pay some attention to their computer or smartphone or whatever they're using to connect to the course?
Yes, I do. I suggest that they, for example, step away and do some walking meditation practice. Then their screen can keep doing what it's doing, but they can look around the room and feel their feet on the floor and this kind of thing. Really helpful,
And it makes me think about, so I was your MBSR student, and when I took the course, it was the old in-person version.
Don't call it old.
Original.
It's only 40. It's not even 40 yet. Next year, I think. in human terms, it's still, 40 is the new 30.
That's right. Okay, sorry. The original, original in-person version of it. And from what I remember, I think we just put our phones away and there was no computer technology involved in the in-person sessions at all.
Yeah, I think that's right, Robert. And we don't use PowerPoint presentations, and we don't, and that partly is a historical phenomena. MBSR is a specific curriculum that was developed at a specific time when specific technologies were available. And because we're interested in researching MBSR, there's been a strong push to maintain the fidelity of that particular form, which is quite wonderful for other reasons than the need to research it, or the interest in researching it.
I mean, that for me raises a whole other topic, which is closely related, of this tension between, I really like the term you use, retaining the fidelity of the original form on the one hand, and making the teachings applicable to people in the lives that they're living now.
Yeah, this is huge. I mean, and this is something that applies. So, MBSR mindfulness, as pioneered in America and the world by Jon Kabat-Zinn, is only 40 years old, so, and already we're challenged to adapt it to the online environment. But you've also got teachers, as I said, I just got an invitation to an online live yoga class, and have many colleagues teaching in the Buddhist circles who are teaching online. So there's those traditions are 2,600 years old, and they have changed, they have evolved, they have, grown and flowered and withered and been renewed many, many, many times in many different cultures. And, that process continues and will continue. You might say MBSR is part of that process.
Yes.
Taking threads both from the Hatha Yoga tradition and from the Zen and Vipassana traditions, and developing something, to use your words, that was applicable to people living in 21st century or late 20th century contemporary cultures. And that's interesting because it has such global appeal. So that's a whole emerging is the word that we use. The other word that gets used so often these days is complexity.
Yeah. So what are you finding? I mean, obviously, it seems like at Center for Mindfulness, there is some decision being made to not replace the original version, but perhaps supplement it with modifications that involve the use of technology to deliver the material.
Well, there's an exploration, and that exploration, first of all, just to say, I don't want to be misconstrued as a spokesperson for the Center for Mindfulness in this podcast. That's not where I'm coming from. And I think I would say there's an exploration, there's an investigation, there's a holding, Robert, of the question that you put forth. How do we honor, respect, maintain, value historical forms? And how do we respond? That's a big piece of the MBSR ethos, of responsivity to what's actually arising, as opposed to or in place of reactivity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's so much in the technological sphere that seems to inspire reactivity, and so it feels to me like it would be, in some ways, we'd be foolish not to apply the methods of responsivity that mindfulness offers in the realm of technology, And it's happening. So there's that too.
And you mentioned, you used the word universal before, and that's also always a challenge and tension between recognizing what is it in these practices that cuts across culture and time and place even, and is universal, or feels like it can be universal, or at least seems like is applicable to many places. I mean, it's kind of amazing that things that Tibetan monks learned 2,000 years ago are still really useful to us here in the US, right, in 2018. and yet there's a real truth there. I don't know the answer to this, but yet it does seem like there can be value in adapting perhaps how some of those universal truths are taught, or the techniques that are applied to convey them, that are more reach people more where they are now.
Yeah. So let's be clear. I'm not a scholar of I'm not a scholar of the history of Buddhism or yoga or mindfulness, or, this is not the history piece isn't my field. And I can say with confidence that it's always been evolving and being adapted, and just a cursory understanding, for example, of the difference between Theravada Buddhism as it's understood in Thailand and Burma, right now, and Tibetan Buddhism as it's understood right now, indicates that there was a lot of evolution and change through cultural forces. So that's been happening. It's been happening in the yoga tradition as well. I don't have a citation for it, Robert, but somebody told me that the term Buddhism actually didn't arise until, I don't know, the 17th or 18th century, when Westerners went east and started languaging the teaching for Western minds, right? Because that, isms, that way of speaking about things is a kind of a Western mode of thought, as I understand it. Yeah.
It's interesting. And I've had more of a background and experience in martial arts, or longer than in sitting meditation. And it's the same thing in martial arts. Until fairly recently, historically, the names of different martial arts and styles were usually very specific. They were like the name of the town in which it was taught, or the teacher. Nahate would be the hand of the Naha region. There wasn't a broader ism that was applied to that teaching. It was very specific. And it was only later, when there was an attempt, not just in the US, but in Japan, to nationalize or apply the teachings across the country and make it something that could be taught in schools nationwide, that people started to come up, and this is only the last 100 years, really, come up with these broader terms.
That's fascinating. It's really interesting. And, in a way, Robert, technology, right, is what's making that possible. Yeah.
Hello?
Oh, no, you're gone. So I just have to laugh at what just happened.
Yes.
Whether you edit it out or keep it in is up to you, but it's just such a really great example of the relationship between human beings and technology, and how it feels to me like how much more challenging it can be for humans than it is for the technology.
Right.
and how important it is that somehow we learn to navigate it in ways that that are healthy,
Yeah, if this does end up getting edited for people listening, what happened is we were both speaking, and then all of the audio went dead. And we spent a few minutes trying to figure out what it was, and I basically restarted the recording. Yeah, I mean, one way I see it is just an example of how, is the word opaque or mysterious the technology can be. And, often it's it feels out of our control. It's also, what's the word? Disconcerting. We lost track of where we had been in the conversation in a way that we wouldn't have if we were sitting next to each other in a room.
That's really interesting, Robert. I also got this warning, this health check warning, which I find to be absolutely hysterical. But in terms of the point that it in some way it broke our continuity.
Yes.
For me, with applying my practice of wakefulness in relationship with technology, one of the most interesting aspects continues to be, even in this example, Robert, how do I stay present with rapidly changing objects? Yeah. So one minute I'm in a conversation with you, deep in that conversation, and instantaneously the object of my attention has changed from our conversation to the recognition that we're not connected anymore, and the process of trying to address that. Yeah. So how do I not get knocked out of my seat, so to speak, in terms of being connected in my life? And that, that right there could form the basis of a lot of practice that might help people with their relationships with technology.
Yeah, I mean, I one thing I've struggled with, I think I've had some improvement, was the feeling when something like that happens, that technology stops working or doesn't work the way I want it to. The feeling, I call it victimhood. There's the pain of the fact that it's not doing what I want it to do. And then maybe it's a kind of second arrow. Oh no, why is it doing this to me? Why does this happen to me so often? And telling that story to myself about what's just happened.
Right. Or why am I not better with technology? I'm so inept. I've never been able to master it. I'm never going to be. I'm getting old, Or just the physiological kind of stress reactivity, the shoulders lift up and the sense angry at the technology is another possibility. So there's a lot of reactions that happen with technology not working the way we think it will. And that's to me fascinating. Was one of the positives that we thought was going to be true about technology, as you understand it, that it would be effective in increasing our speed and our ability to do things. And does that seem to have panned out? That's
right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I know that in the business world, right, there were promises made from the 1960s, right, and certainly 1970s, that introducing computers into the workplace was going to result in this incredible increase in productivity. And people kept being wrong about that for decades. And I think that if I'm right, when it eventually started to be true, first of all, it took many decades longer than anyone had predicted. The increases in productivity were much smaller than people had predicted. And sometimes they were the result of just eliminating jobs, not because computers make an individual person more productive, but because the business, by being able to reduce the number of employees, makes the business as a whole more productive, not an individual person. And the last thing is, this was, maybe it was unexpected, is that, and this relates to our individual experience with technology. When businesses are frequently updating the technology, the amount of time and effort that people have to go to relearn how to use it, then to learn how to use the next version, can cancel out any productivity increases.
So are you familiar with that expression, know where you're going? Because if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there, That's right. So if we're not very good at actually knowing where we're going, we think we're going to greater productivity, we think we're going to greater pleasure, we think we're going to, and we're incorrect, then that, that's a bit of a challenge for us,
It's a challenge. And then I think I've been amazed when I've spoken to people. In fact, I just had a conversation with someone recently who was very sophisticated using technology. The person was an engineer and said that they're still using some very old version of Windows They have an old computer. They haven't updated in years. They use it for writing mostly. I don't think it gets connected to the internet at all. And they had made a conscious choice at one point that they would rather keep using this computer that worked, that they knew how it worked. They weren't going to break it by installing a new version of the operating system. And they didn't want to put so much of their life energy into updating this thing all the time and learning how to use new pieces of software. I thought that's a really good application of mindfulness. I don't think this person was a quote mindfulness practitioner, but I thought there was a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, well, you know, the values of contemplative practice as expressed in the Buddhist traditions, in the yoga tradition, and I'm sure in many other cultural traditions that I just don't happen to be aware of, are fairly timeless. You know, they are things like simplicity, contemplation, respect for nature, wisdom is one that all of those are marks of wisdom in some ways. And it does at times look like technology is simply being harnessed in service of greed, in service of delusion. So I too, I, for example, take at least a month a year when I don't have I have no devices, I turn them off. And I remember saying to you, I was so happy when I realized that the advent of the smartphone was occurring after I had established a habit of having a month or so of silent retreat each year.
Yes.
Because I had already in place the habits, the structures in my personality and my life that supported not getting sucked into the addictive quality of cell phones. And I watched lots of younger people around me and even people in my own generation around me just get sucked right in to the point where they'll say very openly, yes, I'm totally addicted to my cell phone, and that's having consequences, having effects in their lives.
Yeah, I wonder how you approach people then who you're teaching mindfulness, let's say, who don't have that foundation, whether because they're young enough or for whatever reason, they are, let's say, addicted to their smartphone or just suffering consequences of it. And they are doing that without having first developed that foundation in mindfulness practice that you have. Do you find yourself taking a different approach with them than you might with someone who had that foundation first?
That's an interesting question. That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that I do take a different approach because in a way, the essence of the approach is always the same. I mean, Sharon Salzberg, who's a teacher of mine and a dear friend, I've known her a long time, will sometimes say that, she would wait for the esoteric teachings, the real teachings. And always the instruction from the Asian masters would be, notice your breath, and endlessly waiting for some new exciting, method or technique. But from the pith of it, from the essence of it, there is only one instruction, which is pay attention, be present, be here, be in your life, And really, Larry Rosenberg will say it differently. Different teachers will say it differently, but they're all saying the same. We all say the same thing. From that point of view, there's no different approach for somebody who's addicted to technology than somebody who's addicted to, anything. And we're all addicted to something, I mean, in a way, that's the root of our suffering, is that we're, trying to squeeze pleasure out of stuff that doesn't really give us pleasure, in the ways that we hope it will, in lasting ways, and the redirection is to understanding that we can be content and peaceful and happy with things the way they are. So from that point of view, there's no other instruction, and then from the other side, from the side of meeting each individual person, there's always a different, there's always a different instruction depending on the person who's there saying, whatever they're saying. Yeah. So again, this is responsivity based on connectedness with here-ness, and this is why for me embodiment is such a big piece of the process. And it's it's not always an easy sell, so I have broadened my own understanding of embodiment a lot, like giving somebody the suggestion that they might pay attention to their hands on the steering wheel is a really different thing than asking somebody to get into a headstand, but in some sense, those two instructions are very much the same. It just depends on the person presenting and what they are going to have access to, first of all, given their circumstances, what they're going to be able to do, and also what maybe is going to be the most helpful to them. But now now we're really into talking about relationships, human relationships, person to person. And that's very much, as you said earlier, been the mode of practice, the process of the transmission of practice down through the ages. I suspect in all traditions, whatever their home has been culturally and in time. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the relationships. So let's say in an MBSR course, when I was there was, physical relationship in space between all of us when we were there, which to me felt very powerful. I was always amazed there and in any other group meditation setting. I still find it somewhat magical that I could be sitting quietly in a room with my eyes closed and with very little sound, at least no sound of other people moving, and still feel the presence of the other people and feel that it affects my experience of the meditation. And I don't have any good explanation for that, but it feels real to me. So that's what then there's relationship of, let's say, you as a teacher to the students. There's how you interact, including before the class formally starts and after it formally ends or during breaks. All of these are things which are often quite different in the online setting than offline. True.
I don't know. I am kind of outing myself here as a sci-fi geek, right? Because I already mentioned a TV show, but you're reminding me of some books that I actually listened to with my husband through, audio books, which a series of sci-fi books about the Bobiverse. I don't even know who the author is, but in these books, humanity had gotten off of Earth, and they had managed to get some people into virtual reality, so to speak, by somehow disconnecting the mind from the body and putting it into the computer. And it was very interesting. I loved the premise of the books. The big problem for the protagonist, who was one of these, he was the original person who managed to become a computer, basically a virtual. He had to create a really good virtual reality for himself. And most of the people they'd tried to do it with had gone crazy because they couldn't stand being disembodied. They couldn't stand it. It wasn't psychologically possible to be in the computer, right? So they all went nuts. I thought this was great in terms of just, some insight into the human condition, seems like, I could imagine it going that way. I could imagine us trying to drop these earthly forms and, get our minds into the devices so that we didn't have to suffer stuff like heaviness and lightness, aging, sickness, the pain in the body, and I could imagine that being really, really hard for us in another way. And maybe for the reason that you described, Robert, because when you sit together in a room full of people who aren't freaking out on greed or hatred or delusion, who are actually just sitting around holding their minds in their bodies, being aware of their breathing, being aware of their thoughts as thoughts. That's a really powerful situation for us. Our nervous systems, I think, I don't know what evidence there is for this, but my nervous system responds to that. Right. It goes, oh, okay, there is possible safety, there is possible ease, there is possible contentment, and that for me too, Robert, has been a visceral kind of understanding, not simply a cognitive one.
Yes, I mean, we're talking about embodiment, right? There are ways in which our bodies will respond to signals that we may not be aware of at the conscious level, but we can still feel. And you've been very humble in talking about what your background isn't in various ways. And, neither of us are neuroscientists. Maybe I know neuroscience has some explanations for these phenomena now and not for others. Maybe it'll be able to explain more of them in the future, the ways in which our, reptilian brain and other parts of our brain that we're often not as conscious of can pick up on physical signals when we're in the presence of other people, that we don't often perceive at a higher cognitive level.
And what happens to that then when we're online together? I don't know. I have no clue. I can't say when you described your experience of the MBSR class, I smiled and felt something in my chest that I would call warmth, and connectedness and that, that really matters to me as a human being. And that, reminds me of some of the scary stuff around technology, kids playing war games endlessly throughout their youth via computer, never feeling a moment's physical pain, and what happens when we do that? Does that affect our capacity to be compassionate to one another? I don't know. But I do have a loving concern for the human race.
Yeah, I mean, one thing on that point I can say from my experience in martial arts training is that when martial arts are taught well and appropriately, for me, it's given me a very direct, visceral appreciation of how frail the human body is, how easy it can be to inflict pain, what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that, because it's practiced with your own body and that of other people directly. And I can certainly imagine how, I don't know, playing a martial arts video game would not convey that to you viscerally or otherwise. And I've spoken to people who've been in the military or police force or other situations like that, where both through the training and the actual experience, sometimes people on the outside think, oh, it must make them more violent, when in fact, many of those people, because they have felt it or regrettably inflicted some of that pain on other people, know just how serious and painful it is. And it's really imbued them with humility and respect for that pain. And it's something they don't want to do if they ever can avoid it. And I mean, I agree with you. And I know the studies are all over the place about video games, but it's hard for me to imagine that engaging in that kind of simulated violence, but in a disembodied way, can't have some sort of negative effect on people in that regard.
So, I guess as always in human history, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of not knowing. What are the implications? Yeah, I don't know. I say that a lot. What is going to happen? Right. I don't know. Right? And for me, in a sense, that's where mindfulness and contemplative practice more broadly, mindfulness is really popular at the moment, and I'm happy that it's popular because I think there's a lot of promise in that. But contemplative practice in general, throughout human history has had a lot to offer human beings in terms of getting comfortable with uncertainty in a visceral way, learning to be able to exhale completely, even when you're very in touch with the truth of uncertainty, being able to stay steady and clear when you're very in touch with uncertainty. This is part of what contemplative practice, and you're describing, I would include your martial arts in that, by the way. Certainly some of the martial arts traditions, at least, are very much geared toward that kind of skills development, This seems really valuable in our current situation. Yeah.
Meaning the high degree of uncertainty many of us are facing in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think we are always facing it, and sometimes we have strategies that are more about denying it and, stabilizing things that help us deny it. And other times that's not so possible. And so really tuning into what's possible in the face of uncertainty in terms of sustaining our sense of presence with each other and our, for me, valuing humanity, right? Valuing, human relationships and the potential we have to live peacefully together, and the potential we have to respect and care for each other. That's also really a big part of the contemplative traditions.
It reminds me of what you said right at the beginning about some positive experience you've had with teaching MBSR online, that you mentioned the number of different countries and cultures of people that you just had in a course online. And, I'm a believer, and I know many people believe that one way to help break down barriers of misunderstanding or mistrust is just to encourage people to connect with each other directly as human beings in whatever form that takes across cultures, regardless of, without necessarily engaging in some sort of intellectual exchange. And so I know it's very early in the game, but, what have your experiences been, or have you received feedback from any of the students in these online courses about that aspect of it for them and whether they've noticed anything about it? Taking this course online with people from different cultures rather than, in the MBSR course I was in, I would have to guess everyone was coming from within 30, 40 miles of Worcester, Massachusetts.
100 miles anyway. People will travel to a well-respected location, so that's how the center has survived for 40 years, is that folks have come from the Eastern Seaboard,
right.
To be, and so, okay, that's an aside. Let me answer your question. Yes, there has been really positive feedback from participants in the online MBSR classes that I've taught, which are only a handful, because I've only been doing it for a little while here, about connecting across culture. And it's wonderful that the very guidelines of MBSR, while not specifically aimed at diversity work or multiculturalism work, really do support, in my experience, people with wide-ranging views and opinions about life and, how to live, to be together in a space harmoniously or connectedly, or I'm not exactly sure what words I want to use here. Respectfully is another word.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I have seen so far, Robert, is that the shift away from expressing opinions and views, yeah, as a mode of connecting and communicating, yeah, and towards expressing experience, immediate embodied experience, yeah, and sharing that in a non-judgmental way with each other, yeah, is helpful. It's helpful, So if I just report to you that, right now my back aches a little bit and the cat is crying outside and I'm wondering whether we're going to keep talking for another 10 minutes or end in 5. That's one kind of mode of expressing myself, It's a very different mode of expressing myself than telling you that I think cats are better than dogs, and I like computers and don't like people who don't, use them or whatever. That shift toward communicating about direct experience without judgments, and agreeing that we're going to hold on judging each other. Or, we may have them internally, but we don't have to lay them on each other. You know what I mean? Is really very powerful and interesting in the online classroom environment. And I would also just add that for me as a teacher, I really care about teaching and learning as a craft. Like I have been invested for a lot of years in learning the skills of teaching, which aren't necessarily anything to do with me as a personality, So for example, learning to listen well is a skill, learning to hold a group of people online or otherwise is a skill that can be learned. And it's developing those skills, I think, takes a lot of time and care, like anything, like learning to play a piano or learning to be an engineer. These things take a lot of persistence and time and things like that. So I think it's really what we've done at the center is try to translate to the online environment with some of our experienced teachers. Yeah. And I actually feel some caution around the possibility that, one of the challenges of technology, right? Folks who don't have a lot of experience with teaching could very easily hop online with the intention to do any kind of interpersonal work with other people and do damage. Yeah. Right. And that could, and the technology can make that possible, right? Because anybody can put up a web page and say, I want to, I'm going to lead this or that. Yeah. So I have concerns about the degree of power that we've accessed through through technology and whether we're really ready for it. I personally frequently reflect, about the responsibility that comes along with this kind of work.
Yeah, the responsibility towards the people you're teaching because of what the depth of the feeling and personal experience you're perhaps tapping into or connecting within them.
Yes, yeah, one of my basic ethical values, like many people, I'm sure, is not to harm others and not to harm myself, for that matter, which is challenging enough before you give me a computer, and a cell phone and a car and and so I definitely hold those questions with a full heart, and often, we'll practice just setting intentions before I engage with technology, especially when other people are involved, setting the intention to be skillful in the ways that I behave, and of course I don't always live up to my intentions, but I really think it's important.
Yeah, I don't know if this would be an example of what you're talking about, that it's been commented on in many other contexts, that interacting with people through telephone or computer, maybe because it's disembodied, can sometimes lead people not to exhibit the same type of empathy or care towards the other person that they would in person. I mean, long before the computer, people talked about road rage being an example of that, right? There's a physical distance between you and the other driver. You may not even see their face. And so it'd be easier to act enraged towards them in a way you wouldn't if you were sitting next to, face to face with them. And that's certainly, you could say almost the whole internet is an example of that now. But is that the kind of thing you're talking about, making an effort to pay attention to in yourself as a teacher, maybe because the remote interaction, if you didn't pay attention, might lend itself to you not being as attentive to the needs of other people as you might automatically be in person?
That's an interesting question. I think simply yes, and there's also the matter of the fact that if I'm online in a video conference room with 35 other people, that may also be the case for all of them. And I'm the one in the seat that is holding that whole group. Yeah. So my responsibility then isn't just to monitor and check my own actions, but also to create a situation where those 35 other people are also going to be respectful and kind to one another. And in a sense, right, challenges as opportunities and all of that. There's a great opportunity here, particularly when you've got people from all over the world together. I mean, the class of people that I just concluded the session with has decided that they're all going to share their email addresses with each other and endeavor to continue practicing together on their own, and that's like, wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
They feel supported by each other and respectful of each other in ways that in the first class, when we first got together, it wasn't totally clear to me that was going to come together, and it did. So that, it's like, I'm really grateful for that.
I just want to pick up on a phrase you used, which caught my ear, which was they're going to continue to practice together on their own. But isn't it true, right? And particularly it points out the issue of this being online. In a sense, we're more on our own when doing this in front of a computer. But what we're talking about is the opportunity for it to enable us to somehow make that alone practice be together in some way. And we don't yet fully understand what that means to be together when we're doing it remotely.
Well, and in a way, Robert, we're back to the long-standing nature of mindfulness practice, of contemplative practice is a word I sometimes use instead of mindfulness because it's broader. And also the long-standing nature of humans as technology developers. This is always, for as long as we've had history, we've had contemplative practice and we've had technology development. Right. And in some way, the conundrum of being alone together is the basic human conundrum. This is our situation. This is our situation.
Well, maybe I'll take advantage of that to draw this to a close. I think it's really come full circle. I know we could spend another hour or many hours talking about this. Maybe we'll talk again in person and then come back online.
Well, that would be fun, Robert. I clearly this is interesting material to me and to you as well. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to talk together about it and just totally trust you to edit out anything I said that wasn't.
Yeah, we'll use the magic of technology. Okay. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Éowyn. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
That's likewise, Robert. Take good care of yourself, and I hope to see you soon in the flesh.
Sounds good. Bye now.
Bye now.
Thanks for joining us for this Technology for Mindfulness podcast with me, Robert Plotkin, and today's guest, Éowyn Ahlstrom, a mindfulness meditation and yoga teacher and massage therapist, who was my teacher when I took the MBSR course at the Center for Mindfulness. You can find out more about her at middlepath-healingarts.com. If you liked today's episode, please leave us a review on iTunes and share the episode with your friends. Those and all other links are in the show notes, and check out our blog at technologyformindfulness.com for information and tips about science, technology, and mindfulness. I'm Robert Plotkin, and I'll join you next time on the Technology for Mindfulness podcast with Josh Clark, a user interface and user experience expert. We'll talk about how better UI and UX design can help to promote focus, creativity, and mindfulness.